Just want to say hi, hey, hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning into this month's workshop. This one will be a hands-on workshop on detection engineering and the purple teaming process. Just a quick what the switch up is here, why you guys are seeing Tyler's beautiful face over there as opposed to mine this time. I had some family issues come up that I'm dealing with, so he has valiantly prepped and taken this one over for me. I'm fortunate for the moment I can be here right now, so I'll be supporting. And if you have any questions or concerns, poke me and Elaine in the chat. As for the content, you guys are going to have a few hours with us. We've got a hands-on workshop you guys get to play with. It should be a good time. With that being said, Tyler, you want to take it over?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Trey. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Detection and Engineering, a Purple Team workshop. I am Tyler Casey. Thanks for the quick little intro, Trey. And I'll be leading us in our discussion and into the lab. A little bit about me. I have about 10 years of experience doing DCO, defensive cyber operations. Currently, I run the blue or defensive side of our Purple Team engagements, and I'm responsible for a lot of the emulations that we put out through our Empower service. Before I came to Scythe, I was on a CPT, which is a cyber protection team, a Marine Corps CPT. I was on both as an active duty Marine and as a federal civilian for about 8 years or so, a long time. And in that, we deployed internationally in support of incident response and targeted threat hunting operations. And I have my socials up there if anybody wants to connect. Fair warning, my Twitter is mostly just St. Louis sports, InfoSec goodies, and all of our workshops and stuff like that. So feel free to connect. All right. So what do we have in store for today? So we have a lab environment that will allow you to be pretty much every aspect of the Purple Team, including processing intelligence, emulating tactics and techniques, detecting them. It's going to be awesome. It's going to be a lot of fun. We're going to use the Scythe platform to deploy our emulations. We're going to configure Sysmon. We're going to feed logs into our SIEM, which is Kibana in this instance, and then ultimately attempt to find the bad guy, right? And then our lab will be open for a total of 3 hours, and it's at your own pace. But before we dive into the lab, we're going to go over probably about an hour's worth of discussion where we'll talk about some key concepts for both purple teaming and detection engineering. And again, if anybody has any comments or questions or anything like that, throw it in the Q&A or in the chat. Trey and Elaine will be monitoring that for us. All right, purple teaming. Essentially, in a nutshell, purple teaming is when you take threat intelligence, you analyze the CTI, then you create emulations of that malicious activity, you track the emulated actions, and then detect it. It's kind of a quick overview of what it is. A little more detail of it. Purple teaming is a collaborative effort, right? It takes multiple skill sets. It takes teams. It takes CTI, red, blue, management. It's kind of an all hands on deck. And they're all coming together to test, measure, and ultimately our goal is to improve the overall defensive security posture of our environment. So here we have the 5 phases of how we're going to operationalize your purple team. We'll be covering these in depth, but essentially we're going to gather the TTPs to be emulated, going to map those to the MITRE ATT&CK framework to see what coverage we have. We're going to discuss what we expect our results to be, and then we're going to deploy our attack, detect the emulations, and identify any gaps in coverage that we have. Some key responsibilities from different team members here are going to be CTI, the cyber threat intelligence cell or your intelligence cell, depending on what you have. They're going to research and develop the TTPs that will be emulated by the red team, which takes us to the red team, which is going to do the emulation of the TTPs, like I said. And then the lastly of the key responsibilities is the blue team. So they're going to actively be working to determine if our defenses are working, if the emulation was alerted, blocked, or logged. And then these personnel can be your SOC, your threat hunters, your DFIR team, your MSSP if you have one, whoever you have kind of running your defenses. So So if running a PTE or a purple team exercise is unfamiliar to you, the framework that we have here is a great place to start. It's our framework. It's on the Scythe GitHub. That should be open to everybody. It'll cover the requirements, how-tos, how to take the results and turn them into something actionable, which is what we're going to be talking about here. So to kick that off, we have the BAM, the Bryson Attack Model. For those who don't know, Bryson is our head unicorn. He's the CEO of Scythe. So everything we have left of Bang, that blue line where it says access down there at the bottom, is kind of unknown, and we don't really have a real way of controlling it. So we can put some measures in place to monitor, alert, or prevent kind of everything to the left of that Bang the best we can. But everybody knows an incident is not a matter of if, but when an incident is going to happen. On the other side of that, everything to the right of Bang is probably something we can control or control a little bit more, right? So if we know how a threat acts, we know what they're going to want in our environment, what's important to them, and we understand our blind spots, we can control that and use that to kind of continuously improve our defensive security posture. So the recon all the way on the left, the recon and weaponization, probably not going to be able to see this. Or if you see recon, if you have an internet-facing machine or server, it's going to be scanned from the second you put it online until the second it comes offline by pretty much everywhere all over the world, right? There's nothing you can really do about that. It's just the fact of the internet. So nothing we can really do there. The delivery, that is covered a little bit by what vendors offer, such as firewalls or email gateway, break and inspect, things like that. But again, it's kind of out of our, we're not going to block all emails, right? But you have some mitigations in place there to help control it a little bit. Then we go over to what we have more visibility on and what we can control a little bit more. So the installation and C2. These can be a little hard to focus on because of how fluid things can change and how trivial it is to change C2. So if a scan originates from one IP address, the exploit could come from another or be downloaded from another, and then C2 or exfil could come over a third IP address, and you can change IP addresses like that, right? It's so simple now with AWS and GCP and everything like that it's a little harder to detect those. But we have our actions on objective, and that's really where the money is and what we're going to focus a lot on in this talk in our lab at the end. So common actions on host that we can detect and stop before they get a true impact, right? So again, our focus is mainly going to be on what's on the right of Bang, things we can control. We're going to try not to focus too much on what you can't control, right? So for our purple team engagements, we do an assumed breach, right? So you already in our engagements, you're already breached, they're already in. You've heard it 1,000 times. It isn't a matter of if you're going to get breached, it's just a matter of when. It happens to huge organizations all over the world all the time. We need to focus on what happens after those actions on objectives, right? So you don't want to waste your resources having your purple team try to pen test their way in. A pen test could take 2 days, 2 years. They ultimately might just have to be white carded in any way. I don't really know how long it's going to take. And then we know that phishing already works. We see it all the time in the news in our CTI. So we're not going to use a phishing model in our purple team engagement. That can be tested individually on its own. It doesn't need kind of everybody hands on deck to do that kind of training, right? And then lastly, 0 days are expensive. Very expensive. We're going to talk about it here in a second, but it can be very expensive. So we're not going to expect our team to develop a brand new exploit when that's not really what we're looking for. Again, the actions on objectives are things we can monitor and detect on and try to ultimately stop the actions before something bad happens, right? So like I said, the cost of a 0 day can be a lot. You don't want to waste the resources you have and the money you have having your purple team try to come up with an exploit as their way of getting in, right? The cost associated with the development of an exploit can be the cost of your whole team's budget for a year. So we're not going to expect that of our team, and it doesn't really help the purple team process either. We can assume that the adversary is in, and then focus again on those actions on objectives, and that'll help us lead through the purple team engagement. All right. So operationalized purple team kind of looks like that. You can think of purple teaming and detection engineering as continually feeding off of each other. So you run the purple team exercise, you get to your detection phase, which is phase 5, where you identify what's detected, what gaps exist. Your detection team can then improve their collection, processing, and alerting procedures. And we'll get into this in depth. Each of the phases has their own little bit, but as an overview, this is what we're kind of looking for. Using that purple team, operationalizing it to feed into our detection engineering process. So what are some strategic drivers of a purple team engagement? We have data collection, operational capability, and threat understanding. The data collection is our primary driver, as the other drivers can't develop actions without this. We'll get into this. This is just going to be an overview slide for it. Then we have the operational capability, which includes the analyst's capability and how they work with the technology stack, the defensive stack you have to make actionable detections from the logs. And then lastly, those two go and they feed into the threat understanding. Detections do not operate in a vacuum. Having detection capabilities based on and prioritized via a mature threat understanding is crucial. So if you're developing detection content for a threat that isn't in your threat landscape, you could be missing the detections for a threat that's targeting you. So you have your collected data in one, you have the capability of your team in the other one, and then that feeds into understanding what threats you could be affected by. And then you need to prioritize the threats that affect you and your environment. So if you don't have any Mac OS devices in your environment, you probably don't need to focus on developing and deploying a Mac OS centric threat, right? You got to know what you have and then kind of base your purple team engagement off what's important to you. So more into the threat understanding. You need to know who targets you and why. Your threat landscape can help determine what you are most at risk for. So for example, healthcare organizations are constantly targeted by ransomware actors. So you can build in protections and mitigations for an aligned threat, or you could prioritize a ransomware threat in your purple team exercises and research those, deploy those, make sure you have coverage and the detections for that. So you really want to stay focused on, and kind of take it one bite at a time, right? So the most important one that drives everything, like I said, is the data collection. So what is being collected, where is it, and what's important? If you have Sysmon installed, but those Sysmon logs aren't being forwarded into a SIEM, it's probably not even being looked at. You need to understand what you have, make sure it's going to the right place. You don't want an incident response to be the first time you realize that you've never ingested any of your host logs, right? That's kind of the point of these exercises, so you can get ahead of what could be a real issue in a real engagement. And then that takes us to operational capability. I use this term, the detection cyborg, kind of the ties between your analyst and your tools. So the level of capability and proficiency between analysts and tools is the operational capability that you have, that detection cyborg, right? You can't just buy a tool, install it in your environment, don't do anything to it, leave it alone, and just assume that you're good, right? You can't just install Carbon Black and assume that everything that is malicious is going to be blocked and alerted. So your analysts and your tools need to work together, and you need to understand the limitation of both of those things. So if you have an analyst that is deploying Sysmon because they can't get the logic that they want to occur in CrowdStrike, then you basically just wasted your money on this expensive tool when you're using a free one. And kind of vice versa, if you have a new analyst that didn't receive any training on CrowdStrike and is used to something else, then they're not using that tool to the full capability. So while tools are not everything, it's important that you understand how your analysts use them and that your analysts understand how to use them as effectively as possible. And then, time is everything. If you're too slow, you can miss the threat entirely, or you could miss detecting the threat, and the threat could have the impact or the actions. If you're not training constantly, if your searches are slow, if you don't have developed queries, things like that, that time that that you have just gets smaller and smaller. You don't want to wait until an incident or an incident response to find out that you don't have these things, right? The time to start it is now, and the way to do it is probably through a purple team engagement, right? All right, that takes us to the detection engineer process. So for that, we have direction, collection. Oh, sorry, my camera just went blurry. There we go. Sorry about that. We have direction, collection, processing, and dissemination. So your direction is when CTI provides threats for our detection capabilities to focus on. So you can have multiple teams providing this direction, including the Intel team, the CTI team, your DFIR team, a red team. It could be you finding it. Maybe you see something interesting on Twitter or X or LinkedIn or wherever you kind of browse your InfoSec news, and you think that we should try to make sure that we can be alerted or blocked on that threat, right? So that takes us into collection. We need to know what the threat would look like in our environment, in our logs. So we need to emulate the threat with the end goal of generating and collecting logs for what the threat looks like inside of our stack, inside of our tools, in our environment. And then if any logging gaps are identified, they should be fixed or documented as gaps. And in this, we're going to focus on where are the logs, where are the gaps, and start kind of thinking about what detection opportunities we can deploy further on. Then the next step of that takes us to the processing. So processing is where we hunt through logs for detection opportunities. It's where we do the thing. So at first, we're going to start with a wide net, right, in our searches, in our hunt. And then as we hunt through the data, we'll be able to narrow it down to more suspicious activity. But you want to start wide. We'll get more into that in a second. But you don't want to miss anything with that initial throw, right? And then while we conduct this hunt, we are in turn going to develop a query that we could later implement as an alert if it's going to be fruitful, right? And then dissemination, the last step before it kicks back over into our PTE framework, is going to be where we give the stakeholders our deliverables. So some examples of that, we could be giving the SOC an alert for the emulation, or a procedure with documented reasoning, context, and potential responses. For management or the CTI team, they might want to record the content to see what MITRE ATT&CK IDs is covered or what log sources we use. And then for the red team, you might also want to give the red team the same alert that you gave the SOC. So the red team can go in and try to come up with some ways to bypass the alert and then ultimately drive a new purple team engagement with the new emulations that could potentially be bypassed, right? Does that make sense, everybody? Everybody kind of get what I'm saying with that? I'm going to take a sip of water. All right.
Making sense to me, my dude.
All right. So then we brought up CTI a few times. What is cyber threat intelligence? Cyber threat intelligence is used to identify threats and opportunities of threat actors. It could be the TTPs of threat actors, what procedures they use, what software they use, things that they might target, things like that. It's just intelligence about the threat actor itself. All right. So in this purple team engagement, you need to know yourself. You need to know what info your organization has, what the threat actor might be interested in. You need to look introspectively. You need to identify what data you have, where it is, and who can access it. And then you also need to think about activity that's going on in your organization that could make your organization a target. Some examples of that could be like if you have an oil and gas company, that might emit some kind of pollution or something that could get people fired up, some kind of hacktivists or something. So you should be aware of those. Or if you have religious or politically controversial topics that you guys cover or do, like stem cell research is a big one that people feel a certain way about. Or if you have leadership that makes public comments about things that could get some people fired up. All of that is kind of the human side of that intelligence, right? What are you doing and putting out there that could make you a target for different threat actors? So how CTI feeds into direction is that we need to identify what our threat is. We need to research the threat via blogs, webcasts, CISA reports, the MITRE attack. How if you have CTI feeds that come in, however your organization does it, and then in that CTI we're going to extract the TTPs and procedures from that threat, and then we're going to work to close the gaps that we identify of what we were not able to see kind of towards the end. So threat-driven intelligence. So this is a big one. You don't want to, it kind of goes back to what I was saying about the Mac OS, right? If that vulnerability or software or whatever doesn't exist in your environment, then you don't really need to be as worried about it. So that opportunity, if it doesn't exist, or that hostile intent or the capability of the adversary doesn't exist, then it's not really a threat. It's just something that kind of exists out there. So you need to think of who has the capability, and you need to remember that your defensive complexity of your systems and of your stacks will make the level of threat you face rise. So if you have really great defenses, your adversary is going to need to execute at a higher level. I think it was in a Marvel movie in Civil War, Captain America Civil War, when they're talking about the Sokovian Accords, and Vision says that their very presence invites competition, which incites conflict. It's almost like that. You can either have the adversary raise themselves to your level, or you could fall to what their level is on whatever level that is. So that's something that you need to be aware of. And then who has the opportunity? You have a little bit of control in this, right? We could have layered security, also known as defense in depth. We could employ a consistent patching cycle and have solid controls that could kind of reduce the opportunity. And then lastly, what you need to think of is who has hostile intent. Insider threats, competitors, criminals, nation state actors, hacktivists, whatever. So if you add all those together, ABC together, you have kind of your threat landscape. You can maybe kind of think of this as if you have a younger brother that you got into an argument with, he might have hostile intent to hurt you. He might have opportunity. He might be right in front of your face, but that your little brother's never going to beat you up. There's no capability there. So there's no threat. So there's nothing to worry about. So kind of to make light of it, that's one way you could think about it. You really need all three of those things to become a threat. And then shifting some more Intel focus. So we want to focus on suspicious behaviors that may be indicative of malicious actors. We're going to have to embrace a certain amount of false positives and realize that they occur from system administrators, new software installs, or just anomalies in your environment. Computers reach out to all kinds of places that they're all about availability and functionality first and foremost. So sometimes they reach out to weird places or pull down weird things, do weird stuff. So you need to be aware of those. Typically, the vendor focus down there by the artifacts, domains, IP addresses, and hash values. Typically, vendors don't write TTP rules because they could be different based off on your environment. So as a detection engineer, it's our job to either write or tune rules that are tailored to our environment. A SIEM or EDR is like an off-the-rack suit, and our duty is to tailor that suit to fit our environment as closely as we can. We want a snug fit on that suit. We want it to look good and match us, right? And this isn't saying that we should ignore the easy wins, that we shouldn't put in domains, IP addresses, hash values, to pull that stuff back, default C2 profiles. But typically, we want to focus on engineering our detections on behaviors. The vendor focused stuff, you can have all that pipe into a dashboard or get an alert whenever an IP address is found or whatever, or have it just automatically blocked, if you really trust that the vendor rules that come in. But our main focus is on the behaviors of what the adversary is doing. All right, so behaviors at the capstone. How does an adversary conduct actions? So at the base, we have tactics, which is kind of like the big picture. It's what does the threat actor need? Then one level up, we have techniques, and that's where can they get what they need. The last thing we have is procedures, the tip up there at the top, and that's how they can get what they need. So in this example, an adversary needs credential access. That's the tactic down there at the bottom, the what. Where are those credentials stored? They're stored in memory, specifically in LSAS memory. So that's the where. And then how are they going to get it out of LSAS memory with procdump? And then if you want to relate it to a real world kind of a physical action, you could think, okay, I need to, or an adversary, not you. Oh, if an adversary is trying to break into a building that is secured with a badge entry, what is it that they need? They need building access. Where can they get building access? From a badge, either a badge or a copy of a badge, right? How can they acquire the badge? They could take it off an employee, they could bump it, they could copy it, things like that. Does that make sense? All right. And then we kind of already talked on this, but you want to focus also on the human element of the adversary. Human behaviors make good detections. And that's a direct quote from Trey. So threat actors have been kind of mystified to the point where we can forget that they're just people. They're people who who are paid to sit at a desk in front of a computer screen and attempt to exploit a network. They're people who have families, they have evening plans, and sometimes they're careless and lazy, just like anybody else. And the Conti playbook is a great example of this. So the DFIR report, which is a great place to get CTI, if you guys aren't familiar. The DFIR report observed an operator using a click script to copy and paste their actions. We could see in that example there, down there at the bottom, that they forgot to replace the IP placeholder, IP letters, with an actual IP address when they pasted it. And so if they did that in one campaign, it's likely to occur in others. And then I use a term there called a click script. For those who might not be familiar with that, that's essentially when you have every line of your emulation, or this isn't an emulation, every line of your malicious campaign already written out. So when you perform actions on objective, you just copy and paste it from your Word doc or Excel sheet or whatever it is, and you paste it right into your whatever you're using for your C2. So they use repeatable actions, and then we see that in this example. Another Conti playbook example. So 10 years separate these two different campaigns. The one on the left and the one on the right are two different campaigns, about 10 years apart, but they both utilize Conti. You can see they both look pretty similar to each other. They're enumerating the network groups and the computers. They're using some of the same commands. One of them outputs to a file and the other one doesn't, but you can see that they're very similar. These behaviors haven't changed much in 10 years. There's only so many things you can do on an endpoint, right? And there's only so many ways to get them. So that takes us into procedure level intelligence. So you see on the left is all of the tactics and techniques. And then on the right is kind of like an in-depth procedural level of exactly what they're doing. So you can see that run DLL is being executed by Qbot. You can see that it's connecting to 2 IP addresses. You can see some of the host and network and system enumeration there in the middle, and then some more, looks like some registry commands are being run and a scheduled task is being created. So what we're looking for here in your CTI is you want the stuff on the right. You want the commands, you want the IP addresses, you want it to be very specific. The fidelity of that is higher, and it'll make your detections better because you will be detecting what an adversary is actually doing. I mean, I don't know how many ways there are to do network shared discovery, but that's not specific to one actor. Everybody does that. Everybody wants to know what your IP address is. Everybody wants to know what network shares you have. So by getting the procedural level of what's actually being ran, you can make a much better detection that is tailored to the adversary or to the threat that you believe is targeting you or could target you in the future. And then just another example of that, of why you would use actionable procedures vice just normal technique listing. So here we could see that an IP address is communicating via MSHTA MISTA, and that they are running whoami that is then output into a file. It's a lot easier to create a detection on these rather than trying to make up a detection for, technique 1218.005 system binary proxy execution. There's a lot more fidelity in getting exactly or as close to exactly of what the adversary is doing as possible. And that's what the goal in this purple team is, to want to emulate the enemy. You want to be the enemy, be the threat. You don't want to simulate it. You want to be as close as possible to what the adversary is doing. So another example of how you could pull out TTPs and more from some CTI. So in this paragraph here, we can pull out techniques, tactics, procedures, IOCs like hash values and IP addresses, what software they use, what CVE they're trying to exploit. We have their C2 IP address in the front. So from your CTI, you can pull out a lot of information that you can build your detections off of, or your emulations and then detections off of. Excuse me. So again, testing against technique IDs is not a reliable way to tell if you're able to detect behaviors from threat actors. So in this example, we see the technique of process discovery has two different procedures: our observed procedure of get process and the tested procedure of task list. They're not the same. So what it calls is different. One, they can both be run in PowerShell, but get process is a PowerShell command line. Task list will run in CMD and command prompt. What it outputs is similar but not the same. The command line is different. So we want to emulate the observed procedures as closely as possible to ensure that our detections are as accurate as possible. You know what I'm saying? Elaine, I don't know if you know, but your camera is on. We can all see you. Say hello. All right. Oh, chat. All right. So some templates. You need to have documentation. Without documentation, you're not going to be able to kind of enforce anything in the end. Everything is like, oh yeah, we'll get to it. If you don't have it written down and documented, it's likely that's not going to happen, or it's not going to be executed as well as it could be executed. So some templates, if you don't have any inside of our Purple Team exercise framework, they're on our GitHub. We have this template which can help you get started with gathering procedural level intelligence. So you can table out the observed TTPs. You could write down how you're going to emulate it, identify detection opportunities ahead of time that will help execution go much smoother. And also, if maybe you don't have a lab, or maybe you're not able to do a Purple Team engagement for whatever reason, you could use this to kind of tabletop what is happening and kind of talk about what's happening and maybe come up with some detections you could put in place anyway. So it's good to have everything written down. Everybody knows that. I don't know why my camera keeps going all blurry. So weird. So yeah, check that out. It's on our GitHub. Very useful, especially if you don't have one that's already starting out. All right, so back to the detection engineering process. So now that we have the direction, we have that CTI, we have some thoughts about what we're going to do. We need to make sure that those logs exist, that we have the collection. So we need to know what the threat would look like in our environment. So we could have a red team or CTI team emulate the threat or do it ourselves, but the end goal is to generate and collect logs for what the threat looks like inside of our stack. And then if any logging gaps are identified, said you need to document those. Where are the gaps? Where are the logs? And then you could start to think about those detection opportunities, like we said. So in the collection phase, we're going to verify the data collection and identify gaps, identify logs, like we said. I think most of us have heard the phrase, pics or it didn't happen. In this instance, it's logs or it didn't happen, or PCAP or it didn't happen. You can't detect what isn't logged. So it's imperative that we ensure we are logging appropriately. So this isn't to say that you need to log everything, because you can't. If you log everything, it'll lead to log fatigue and things will get missed. If you have 50 billion logs a day, you can't look through that. A whole team of people can't look through that. So the collection will kind of help guide what's important, and we'll talk more about what's important and how to kind of gauge that here in a little bit. But doing the purple team engagements are really invaluable to being able to tune your log sources and what's being ingested, without the logs becoming too bloated or too expensive. They need to be manageable. So we'll look at some data source components. So I'm going to look at what logs are needed to write an alert. And at the base level, a lot of detections, this is for Windows, a lot of detections can be written from the Windows security log, which is native to Windows, obviously, or Sysmon, which is free if you install it. So if you're in MITRE ATT&CK looking at behaviors or threat groups, towards the bottom of the page, they'll have a detections section. And this section is very useful to start thinking about where you can detect these actions from. It provides information about what behaviors are used for that command and maybe some tips on how to detect it. Some of them even have some detection analytics written out, which is a part of their CAR, the Cyber Analytic Repository that MITRE hosts. So MITRE ATT&CK Framework is really a great resource to help getting started on it. A little more on that, in addition to detections, MITRE ATT&CK also provides a data sources section. So this data source here is for process creation. It'll break down the tactics and techniques, how to detect them, and what event IDs you can search on to find the events. So in this example, we see process creation via technique 1548, abuse elevation control mechanism, which is when a process attempts to elevate to system level permissions, and they have an analytic there to aid you in your detection efforts. So very useful. MITRE ATT&CK is really a lot of good stuff there. All right, so get into the weeds a little bit more. How do we map these data sources or events in our environment? So we see that the process creation will create a log entry with an event ID of 4688. 4688 will also show us what user created the process, what user executed a command, as well as some metadata about the process itself. So using this, we can begin to kind of map out what coverage we have for different behaviors. And of course, you can expand the event logs on this to include your security logs or Sysmon or whatever EDR solution you use, whatever event IDs that they have per your EDR solution or your security stack. Which takes us into detect. This is also done by MITRE. Shout out again. So the MITRE detect will provide a really good visualization of data sources and their coverage. So you input your data sources and coverage into here, and then it will also show you additional data sources from MITRE where that technique could be identified. So in this example, we see that it's got technique 1087, which is account discovery, and we have coverage of this from the command execution or process creation data sources. MITRE also says that you could identify this via file access and user account metadata. It also has the product of Sysmon, so you can input what you have into it, and it really will make a picture of what you can see and kind of help you track what your coverage is. Okay, so now we have an example of a command. If you guys could put in maybe the answer to where the logs for this are in your environment. So if someone runs a netview/all/domain, where would you look for that in your environment? In the scene? 100% agree. So ideally, this is my opinion, you want to hunt in the seam as much as possible. You want one centralized location where data can be correlated, right? You don't want to have 50 million tabs open trying to see the EDR dashboard and the seam dashboard, or maybe you don't have anything, you don't want to have to PS remote into a system to query the logs. You don't want that. You want it all in the seam. So ideally, in my perfect situation, it'd be in the seam, and I would be looking for Sysmon event ID 1, which is process creation, or security event ID 4688, which is also process creation. Do you guys use Sysmon? What kind of EDR do you guys have? If you feel comfortable saying, I'm just curious. Yeah. Splunk, that's what I'm talking about. Under my Scythe shirt, I have a Splunk t-shirt on. It says looking for trouble. But all right. So we have logs. We need to prioritize the data collection and kind of what we want to ingest. Because again, you can't have it all. You want it all, but you can't. It's just too much. People can't look through it. So what is the happy middle? In the grand scheme of things, right? If we're looking for the most bang for our buck, what would you ingest? Command execution or driver load? So command execution, you can see it's got 243 out of 250 of the attack techniques can be found in that data source, right? So where driver load over there has 10. Now those 10 might be really important. You don't know. You got to see what the coverage is, what the gap is, what the overlay is between the two of those. But so command execution is going to cover more attack techniques, but it's not going to detect like process injection where a driver load might. If someone is loading a DLL or utilizing a DLL through a process, that probably isn't going to be logged from process creation or command execution, but your driver load should tell you what drivers were loaded. So again, you need to, this is for your environment and your risk appetite, really. So you need to look at what coverage you have of behaviors, and maybe if you don't want to ingest driver load, maybe something else overlaps that where you can see it, right? And that's kind of the point of this whole Purple team again, is to know and understand your environment and your coverage. And you don't want it to be when you're on an incident response. When I was on the CPT, we got called to an incident response somewhere, and it was a cloud incident, and they realized that none of their cloud logs were being forwarded into their main seam. So they had, I think it was like 100 terabytes of data for the last year, because they didn't know when the breach started, that they had to rehydrate, whatever the term is. They had to rehydrate it, put it in their seam. So they had 3 or 4 different seams we were looking at that were all getting different information. One had IP addresses, one had usernames, one had the event, and they had to try to correlate all of those things. It was really crazy. Very stressful, real life. It was really something. So you don't want the first time that happens to be in your incident. You want to know and train on it and get ahead of it. Yes, Natasha, it was miserable, and it was a seam. It was not Splunk, so it was a little. Yeah, it was really something. All right, so some more into the detection engineering process. So we're done with the collections. We talked about the logs. We know about the logs. I know. I'm moving on. So now we're in the processing. So we have our logs, we have our coverage. What do we do with them? We're going to process them. Processing is where we hunt through the logs for detection opportunities. So again, at first, we're going to cast a wide net, and then as we hunt, we can narrow it down. We can exclude things. We can whitelist things or allow list things, and we'll narrow it down to try to really only capture the suspicious activity. And again, the queries that we use, we could later implement as an alert if they're fruitful. Excuse me. All right. So knowing our sources and logs, we can start to think about what detection opportunities might exist. So then we will test our hypothesis by starting again with a broad search with some false positives, but that's okay. not a big deal, not something we can't work through. We want to make sure we have everything first. Once we have it, then we'll narrow it down um, into into a better detection, right? So if you're fishing and you cast a net, you're not trying to catch one specific fish down there. You're going to catch as many as you can, and you'll sort through them later. And that's kind of how we're going to start. It's not how we're going to end, but it's how we're going to start. So an image of that, casting a wide net. So um, you want a broader search, and that's okay. We're gonna capture as much as we can, and then we're gonna work at tuning them, and then kind of working on our allow lists and exclusions and things like that. So it's gonna go from this. Well, let me back up. Sorry, getting a little ahead of myself. So this is the wide net. That's what we want. We don't want to start like this, where we only capture a very, very small amount of the malicious events. So if you start too small or you shrink the scope too fast, you might catch the malicious events, but like in this example, you're only catching about 18, 20% of it. There's still a lot of other activity that's going on that you might totally miss. If it's happening on how many boxes we have there, let's say 12. If it's happening on 12 machines and you only catch it on two and you stop the two of them, it's still happening on 10 other machines. You need to try to capture it all in the beginning and then narrow in as you have more of an idea of the situation that's going on. So in this, we reduced our benign events, our fine events, but we focused too small, and that led to missing more of the malicious events. So we have some false negatives, which is not what you want. It's better to have false positives that you can roll out than false negatives, which is when you miss an event entirely and you think everything is fine. That is not what you want, because who knows how long it'll be before you go back in and look again. So ideally, we want something that looks a little more like this, right? We want to tune out the benign events while still capturing most of the malicious events. This is, detection engineering is more of an art than a science. There's a bit of give and take into it. So we're going to have an acceptable level of benign events, and it's fine. It's not a big deal. You don't want to miss those events by making it too narrow, like we saw in the previous slide. So you could think about a user who's listing a file. What's a normal threshold of files or folders for a user to dig through, right? Probably only a couple. They're going to do it from the CLI or from Explorer, probably from Explorer. Most people aren't going through the file system through command line. I'm sure everyone on this call does. That's what I do most of the time, but most people don't do that, right? Normal users not going to do that. And then you could think even more about it in an automated directory listing and reading of files using a tool like Snaffler, for example. It's going to look like a rapid fire of listings. It's going to be firing off on every drive. It's not a normal user interaction, and we can kind of tune that out. So having these thresholds and these kind of like specifics that we're talking about can help us make better detections. So instead of just being like anyone who lists a file, I want a detection on, probably not. It's going to be too much. You want anyone listing a file on CLI, I want an alert on, or anyone who lists 15 files in a row, I want an alert. In this time window, in a 10-second window, if you have looked at more than, I don't know, what's a good number, 25 files, I want to know about it. That's a better way. So you might get some benign events. Maybe somebody likes going through the CLI, or maybe someone likes opening 100,000 files at once. Maybe they restored a previous tab or window and it's getting it all at once. We can work through those benign events and come up with a better detection for it, right? And then some events just aren't good detection opportunities, right? They're too common, too many people do it. It's not feasible. So an example of that is maybe with IP config. So it's a common troubleshooting step. Some users go in and do it. It's probably going to have a lot of false positives around it, and it's going to be hard to build a detection on it. So you want to focus on things you can control, kind of like what we said in the beginning. You want good detections with limited false positives, and don't try to force a detection that isn't working. We're going to have plenty of other detections in there that we can go and find. You don't want to chase around something like IP config or something else that's very, very common, and miss something else. one of the things I really like about the MITRE ATT&CK framework, and I would teach to people, is if you detect it somewhere on the framework, you can kind of assume previous actions and hunt for things retrospectively. And what I mean by that is like on, let's say an adversary goes through a kill chain completely, right? And they perform their actions on objectives. Their actions on objectives is website defacement. You can take that website defacement and look backwards and think, well, what would they have to do from network or from website defacement previously? They'd have to gain execution. They probably have to download something. Someone would have to log in, maybe a brute force, things like that. That's a little out of scope of what we're talking about. It's more hunting through the seam, but don't get tied up on one thing. There's going to be other chances, if that makes sense. All right, so some questions to help you in the processing phase. You really need to put on kind of your analytic thinking cap, right? We're going to think about how procedures can be used maliciously, how often you would see those procedures, what spawns those procedures, and then a procedure. I know I've said this word a lot. I don't know if we defined it yet, but a procedure could be leveraging an application, writing a registry key, creating a scheduled task, running a specific command. It's basically like what are you doing, the most granular level of what is happening. So there's some questions there. We could think of maybe if PowerShell is commonly used in your environment, you could use some of these questions to help you tune out the benign events and focus more on the malicious activity. So is it common in your environment for PowerShell to run? Probably. Is it common for PowerShell to run encoded commands? Maybe not. If it's not, it could be something to alert on. Is it common for, let's say, Oracle to spawn PowerShell or for PowerShell to download files? Probably not. So you could alert on that. And then you could kind of chain some of these questions together to really create the most robust detection that you can while limiting the false positives. So just because your first search was index equals main PowerShell, asterisk on either side, you have 50 bajillion events, right? You could kind of go through and dig through like, oh, what was the parent process of this? That's kind of abnormal. Or you could be like, oh, this administrative script runs every day. So I can probably exclude that or talk to the administrator and see if you can kind of tune it that way. Some more questions we have to kind of aid in the tuning of your detections are, I said, the parent process, child process, common command line parameters that maybe don't seem so common, which will make more sense here in a second. And a big one is the network connections, right? If you have PowerShell doing a network connection, that's probably odd in your environment. Maybe it isn't, but it probably is. If you see what else? Command prompt or bits admin, different things reaching out to the internet, sites you don't expect. That's definitely something you could easily tune and make a detection on. All right. So what are parts of this procedure and how are they used maliciously? So we have cmd.exe/c, which is telling it run this command, running whoami, and then it's using that caret, that greater than symbol, to send it to this redacted.txt file. So what on here is interesting? So we have command line that launches whoami. That's kind of odd for someone like a normal user or administrator to do. I don't know if there's any sysadmins on here, but you're probably not going to open command prompt to type cmd.exe/c whoami. You're just going to run whoami, and then it outputting to a file could also be kind of strange. It could be something that maybe an administrator is trying to gather all of the users that are logged in or something. I mean, there's a reason for it maybe, but it should be pretty uncommon where it would kind of get the gears turning and maybe kick off some of an investigation. Another one, how often do these components appear in normal operations? So again, like how often does someone go in and launch CMD to then rerun CMD/C whoami? Probably not very often. You could look at how often is whoami used. It's very easy to do in a SIEM. It's just a simple stats count. You You can see how often that's being run, how common is it for that information to be redirected. Again, it's probably not that common. If I was going to run who am I would just open command prompt, type who am I, and then close out, right? I'm not going to output it to a file with a strange name. I'm not going to tell CMD to launch it that way. So a little odd. Another one to look at, you could see again what common parent processes you could tune out or tune in. So you could look at what process spawned this. Is it an administrator script? If an administrator script is running it, it's probably not malicious, and you could talk to the admin. He or she, they're just a person. You could talk to them and be like, hey, I'm seeing this. Is this something you're doing, something you're behind? They're like, oh yeah, I run that every day to do XYZ. Like, okay, cool. I know that this is fine. I won't worry about it. Or maybe, speaking of parent processes, maybe this process was spawned by Word. That's pretty suspicious, I would say, and would probably warrant a little more investigation. And then again, that /c is just so odd for a user to run. A normal user is not going to run that. I don't think. I haven't in my experience. So yeah, something to look out to. Human behaviors make good detections. And then speaking of suspicious parent-child relationships, here is an example of some lol bins, which are living off the land in binaries. If you guys aren't familiar, that attackers can commonly use, which in and of themselves, these commands aren't bad. They're native to the system, which is why attackers like to use them, because they don't require you to download or do anything odd to run these. But when you have a parent process of, in this example, W3WP, which is IIS, becomes a little more suspicious. So if you see CMD launching Who Am I, which was launched by W3WP, that's pretty weird. You could probably assume that that's malicious, or at the very least, it's going to require some more investigation, right? And then, are there any common child processes you can tune in or out? So if you see the lol bins being launched from like a productivity application like Word or Excel, probably pretty suspicious, right? Why would Word need to launch CMD to perform a normal function? And then in this example, what commands are cmd.exe running? And then what spawned Word or Excel? If Outlook spawned Word that spawned CMD that made a network connection or something, could be a phishing attempt, could be something malicious that's embedded in the file. So something, just some questions to kind of ask yourself as you're going through it. It's the parent-child relationship, I think, is a very interesting one. It's how I like to look through things. Who is spawning it can be pretty indicative of what's happening. And then again, are there any users we can tune in or out? So if an administrator runs this, you could exclude them from the query, or maybe it happens so infrequently that you just leave everybody in there and you deal with the few benign events that you get. So that's up to you and your kind of your risk appetite. And then we're gonna do this is the last question that we're gonna go over, and it's on, does the process make network connections? So again, is PowerShell normal in your environment? Probably. Is PowerShell making network connections to the internet normal? Probably not. So you could use those and kind of chain them together to make a better detection. All right. And then events aren't the only things we can build detections off of. There's also state changes through the enterprise that could be used to build detections as well. So you could think of, like, if you use that command down there at the bottom, do our users often mount drives from the CLI? Is sysinternals something a user or admin would need? Were there any downloaded files after mounting that drive? And then you can kind of quickly pick up on an attack chain off of something like this. So you could think of events changing, users being added, permissions changing, drives being mounted, things like that. It's not always just the command line that's being used, right? And then the last step in our detection engineering process is dissemination. And that is, again, where we give the stakeholders our deliverables. So the SOC may receive an alert with context and documentation. The intelligence seller management may want to see what coverage we have across the different tactics and techniques. They may also want to know if there's a coverage gap that needs to be addressed. The red team, if you give them the same alert that you gave the SOC to, that you gave the blue team, they can go in and try to come up with some bypasses for that alert. So you could really broaden the detection to try to cover as much as possible. And then if they come up with a bypass for it, you could start the process all over again and make sure you have coverage over that emulation as well. All right, and then the structure of your dissemination. If you don't have any structure for it yet, to disseminate your Purple Team findings or a write-up template, we recommend utilizing the Palantir's Alerting and Detection Strategy Framework, which is free. It's on GitHub. Excuse me. Sorry, guys. Oh, goodness gracious. I'm so sorry. It's a great starting point that will take you from researching techniques to discussing why that technique or detection is important, what to look for, what could be a false positive, all the way to see what the response is for that technique or procedure if it's seen in your environment. I would highly check it out, or highly recommend for you to check it out, even if you do already have a template or a structure in place. Just maybe get some more ideas or see how other people do it. All right, and then one of the last things we're going to talk about. We're almost to lab time. I know it's a lot in the beginning, but is Sigma. So Sigma is an open source structured format for writing detections that's written in YAML. Sigma HQ is the creators of it, and they house thousands of community detections for us to utilize and contribute to in their GitHub repo. So essentially, it allows you to write detections in a format that can be converted to the query or command line structure of multiple tools and SIEMs, including Splunk, Kibana, ArcSight, Carbon Black, the FireEye HX, etc. Basically, if it has a query bar, it can translate it. And then your Sigma rules can be converted very easily using tools such as SigConverter or Uncoder.io, which is a website. You just copy and paste the rule into the browser, choose what SIEM or what tool you have, and then hit translate. So their GitHub looks like this. This is where they host all of their current rules. Has a search function up there at the top to assist you in your detection. In this snippet, we're looking for detections related to 7-zip. So you can kind of see some of the rules that they have there. They also have a website called detection.fyi, which is very useful. It has all of the same rules that's in GitHub. They're linked together, but it's got more of a friendly UI if you don't like kind of the minimalist text-based feel of GitHub. And then here's just an example of a relatively simple Sigma rule. This rule will detect potential DLL files that are downloaded via the invoke web request commandlet in PowerShell. For this detection to trigger, it will have to contain either invoke web request or IWR in the command line and contain HTTP out file and DLL in the command line. For if you're interested in Sigma, we give a workshop on Sigma called Weaponizing Sigma that we go through, and we learn how to read, create, curate, and deploy the Sigma rule in our SIEM, and then we deploy some adversarial actions to test if the detections worked. So if you're interested in that, check out the Scythe workshops page for coming up in the future. We did one. I think you could sign up for the previous recordings and then get a copy of it. So before we get into the labs, does anybody have any questions for me or over anything that we talked about? Okay, nothing seen. So the last two things I'm going to talk about before we go into the labs are Go Purple for Good. So we have a swag Scythe page. Everybody loves swag. I got some Purple Team Unicorn hoodie right now. A portion of all of the swag proceeds go to a conservation effort for rhinos, also known as chubby unicorns. There's some great stuff in there, so go ahead and check it out. A lot of it's donated to charity. It's a good cause, and they put a lot of work into it. They got some really good stuff in there. And then Unicon 2024. I think that Elaine had put that in the chat also. But we have Unicon 2024 coming up on April 9th, which is National or International Unicorn Day. It's from 11 to 6 Eastern Time, totally free, 100% virtual. We have a great lineup. We have Dave Kennedy of Trusted Sec as the keynote speaker. Leslie Carhart, who's Hack for Pancakes on Twitter, the technical director of Dragos, Bryson Bort, who is our CEO, the head unicorn, and a bunch more on there. It's going to be fun. There's going to be swag giveaways, so be sure to sign up.